Question number 1. A poem by this author calls a woman a thin brown mouse living all alone in this cold house, and contrasts her with a woman who, quote, stayed home and scraped life with a fine-tooth comb, unquote. This author of Sadie and Maud set a poem in a rented back room inhabited by two women who have lived their day and are mostly good, for whom dinner is a casual affair. In addition to The Bean Eaters, her works include a collection of poems about a girl growing up in Bronzeville called Annie Allen. Her most famous poem is about a group of pool players at the Golden Shovel who lurk late, strike straight, jazz June, and die soon. For 10 points, name this first African-American Pulitzer Prize winner, the poet of We Real Cool. And the answer to that toss-up is Gwendolyn Brooks, or Gwendolyn Elizabeth Brooks. Toss-up number 2. One of Walter Savage Landor's, quote, imaginary conversations, unquote, portrays a discussion of love between this man and Rhodope, his supposed lover. This native of Samos is given the power of speech by Isis in a fictional romance named for him. Babrius rendered this author's work into verse, and the scholar Phaedrus translated this writer into Latin. In one of this writer's stories, one of the title figures spends the summer singing and in the winter is forced to beg the others for food. This author, probably born a slave, also wrote a story in which the second title figure takes a nap midway through a race and ultimately loses. The Ant and the Grasshopper and The Tortoise and the Hare are by, for 10 points, what ancient Greek writer known for his fables? The answer to that toss-up is Aesop. Next toss-up. This sort of object provides the surname of an innkeeper who owns a mysterious smoked-over oil painting and tells the protagonist that another character is out peddling shrunken heads. In the first chapter of the novel in which he appears, that protagonist describes finding himself stopping before warehouses full of these objects. A character climbs into one of these objects with an idol named Yojo after falling ill with a fever and later decorates it with carvings. A canoe-like object of this sort is reworked by a carpenter into a life buoy. One of these objects, made by Queequeg, emerges from a whirlpool after the Pequod sinks. For 10 points, Moby Dick ends with Ishmael floating on what sort of object usually used to store dead bodies? And the answer to that toss-up is coffins. And at different points in the question, I could have prompted on canoes, buoys, or sea chests. Question number 4. A novel set in one of these places features Thady Quirk, an early example of an unreliable narrator, and was written by Maria Edgeworth. A group of otherwise mute travelers are only able to speak with tarot cards in a novel titled For One of These Places, written by Italo Calvino. The protagonist of a novel titled For One of These Structures is assigned the assistants Arthur and Jeremiah and uses the messenger Barnabas in his many efforts to schedule a meeting with Clam. That example of these structures is located near the Herrenhof Inn, where a land surveyor struggles against the endless bureaucratic roadblocks it produces. For 10 points, a man named Kay tries to enter what type of structure in an unfinished novel by Franz Kafka? And the answer to that toss-up is castles. Could have also accepted Castle Rack Rent, or the Castle of Cross Destinies, or the Castle or Das Schloss. Next question. An author who returned to this country, his ancestral homeland, in 1935, made his name with the novel Wolf Solent. An author from this country wrote about people who, though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again, in a poem that describes a time when, though lovers be lost, love shall not. A character from this adopted home of John Cowper Powys holds Edmund Mortimer captive and proposes, lending his magic to Hotspur's rebellion in Henry IV, Part 1. A poet from this country wrote, "And death shall have no dominion," and a poem that urges the addressee to rage against the dying of the light. For 10 points, name this country, the birthplace of Owen Glendower, and the author of Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, Dylan Thomas. And the answer to that question is Wales. I could have also accepted Cymru, and I would have to prompt on Great Britain or the United Kingdom or the UK, but I could not have accepted or prompted on England. Next toss-up. This poet described floating in the ocean, seeing a butterfly overhead, and reminiscing about his dead wife in the poem Amphibian. The narrator of another poem by this man claims, "Man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what is heaven for?" That narrator dreams of working on one of the 4 great walls in the New Jerusalem alongside Raphael and Leonardo while painting his wife Lucrezia. Other artworks in this man's poetry include a bronze statue of Neptune taming a seahorse cast by Claus of Innsbruck and placed near a painting of a woman who liked whate'er she looked on. The narrator of a dramatic monologue by this poet killed his wife because she had a heart too soon made glad. For 10 points, name this poet of Andrea del Sarto and My Last Duchess. The answer is Robert Browning. Toss-up 7. A mural painter in one of these locations decides to kill himself by making an appointment with the Federal Bureau of Termination in Kurt Vonnegut's story To Be or Not to Be. Shortly after Howard and Ann Weiss get home from one of these locations, a baker insistently calls them to ask them to pick up a cake for their son in Raymond Carver's story A Small Good Thing. A character dreams that one of these places is a mechanical slaughterhouse where Old Blastic is killed. Dale Harding is among the acutes who live in one of these places in a novel whose protagonist convinces the prostitute Candy to sleep with the stuttering Billy Bibbit. Chief Bromden escapes from one of these locations in a novel in which Randall McMurphy butts heads with Mildred Ratched. For 10 points, name this type of institution where Ken Casey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is set. And the answer to that toss-up is hospitals. I could have also accepted mental hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, the Chicago Lying-In Hospital, mental asylums, insane asylums, or mental institutions. Next toss-up. A work of theory fiction from this country that discusses ideas like the Tellurian insurgency against solar capitalism is entitled Cyclonopedia. An author from this country wrote a book that recounts an incident in Oklahoma in which a group of students tortured another student who they suspected of being a secret police agent. The narrator of that book meets a killer who she calls her magician after being expelled from a university post. A girl from this country is sent to Vienna to attend a French school at the end of The Story of a Childhood, the first part of an autobiographical graphic novel by an author born in this country. A memoir from this country is about a book club whose members read The Great Gatsby and a novel by Vladimir Nabokov. For 10 points, name this birth country of Marzan Satrapi and Asar Nafisi, the authors of Persepolis and Reading Lolita into Tehran. And I could have accepted for that question Iran, Iran, or Persia. Next toss-up. In a play by this author, a gentleman protests that Louisa doesn't rhyme with Whitsun week, while listening to love poetry addressed to his chauffeur's sister Louisa. One of this playwright's characters says that to be in hell is to drift, and to be in heaven is to steer, during a debate about the life force. In a play by this author, it is revealed that Anne persuaded her father to name the author of The Revolutionist Handbook as one of her guardians in a scheme to marry him. That play about the anarchist Jack Tanner includes a third act called Don Juan in Hell, which is often performed separately. This author used the Serbo-Bulgarian War as the backdrop for a play in which Raina Petkoff calls Bluntschli her chocolate cream soldier. For 10 points, name this author of Man and Superman and Arms and the Man. And the answer to that toss-up is George Bernard Shaw. And the final toss-up for this packet, for this video, this word precedes the phrase, I listen, before the statement that, quote, for many a time I have been half in love with the easeful death, unquote, in John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. A poem with this adjective in its title describes how the tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres. An animal described by this adjective reminds the speaker of, quote, some blessed hope whereof he knew and I was unaware, unquote, in a poem that begins with the line, quote, I leant upon a coppice gate, unquote. A place described by this adjective is, quote, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, unquote, and is, quote, where ignorant armies clash by night, unquote. That place is a metaphorical plain mentioned in Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. For 10 points, name this adjective that describes the title thrush of a poem by Thomas Hardy. And the answer to that question is darkling.